from Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Deputy Premier. Mr. Speaker, in March of 2015, the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund gave $4 million to California-based Rentec to convert 2 sawmills in Wawa and Atikokan into wood pellet manufacturing plants. It sounded like good news. It was projected to create 60 jobs in these communities. In February of this year, less than 2 years later, Rentec closed the Wawa plant, and now they have the Atikokan plant up for sale.
Oh, the money's
News
gone.
coverage says the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund is asking the company to pay $2.5 million back, but Rentec seems to believe they have complied with their commitments. Speaker, will the Deputy Premier please tell Ontarians how this government is going to make sure this company doesn't leave Ontario without repaying the money?
Thank you. Deputy Premier.
To the Minister of Energy, please.
Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Always pleased to rise and talk about the great work that's happening in Northern Ontario and a lot of the accomplishments that are happening thanks to the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund. The Northern Ontario Heritage Fund is continuing to invest in creating a diverse economy in Northern Ontario and one that's creating jobs. Just last week in my riding of Sudbury, when I had the Minister of Agriculture and Small Business and the Minister of Labour with me in Sudbury, Mr. Speaker, we talked about some of the programs that the NOHFC has been bringing forward to help mining companies, to help forestry companies, to help the movie sector, Mr. Speaker. We are creating more film and television programs in northeastern and northwestern Ontario, Mr. Speaker, that it's creating over 1,200 jobs. We are making sure through our due diligence, Mr. Speaker, that Northern Ontario is continuing to grow and prosper thanks to the investments that this government is making through the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister didn't seem to understand my question. This is not the first time that the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund has invested in companies only to see them leave before their commitments were fulfilled. Earlier this year, Great Lakes Graphite left Ontario just 10 months after the government gave the company $400,000. Our leader is committed to penalize companies that take advantage of government programs and then leave town. Speaker, what has this government done to ensure future Northern Ontario Heritage Fund grants don't go to companies that are not committed to staying in Northern Ontario?
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, very pleased to stand and talk about the $100 million a year investments that we are making to ensure that the priorities of Northerners are being met. And since 2003, Mr. Speaker, the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund has invested $1.2 billion, which has directly created over 32,000 jobs across Northern Ontario, helping Northerners live, work and build careers in the North, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk about a few of those things. We've expanded broadband to 100,000 more people in Northern Ontario. $32 million of that, Mr. Speaker, has been invested to support the expansion of broadband infrastructure into 21 remote First Nations communities. $6 billion invested since 2003 in our Northern Highways program, Mr. Speaker. Keeping the Minister of Transportation busy, we're continuing to finish the expansion of Highway 69, making our roads safer and bringing more economic development to Northern Ontario.
Thank you. New question.